Okay, so you join me here today at the beautiful Packington Somers, and we're here to do a bit of general method feeder fishing. This time of year, coming out of summer now, and things have started to change. A few different changes that I've made with my feeder fishing to help me catch a few more of these. It's a nice fully scaled mirror, that one. See if we can hold him up. Beautiful fish, that one. Look at him, fully scaled. Just put him back. Might have seen the bright hook bait I was using there, one of the spikums in the pink. So like I said, at this time of year, the water started to cool down a little bit. Fish are a little bit more lethargic. They're not feeding as aggressively as they were in the summer months, where you're sort of casting regularly. You may be using different hook baits like maggots or smaller baits like pellets to get you a quick bite. Here it's all about being a bit more patient, especially this time of year. You're not looking for so many bites, and generally your feeder's out there for longer, so that's when you make a few changes. I'm just going to load the feeder. As you can see, I've got a 4-inch hook length. I've got quite a heavy duty 019 with a size 12 MCM hook. I've got a spikum there. See, the hook bait's not falling off, ready to go again. So I'm just going to load the feeder. Interestingly, I'm actually fishing a method feeder today, although in winter I'm generally fishing a sort of banjo feeder. Today we're opted for a method feeder because I'm fishing on like a shallow bar in the middle of the lake. I'm just going to cast this out. So I'm chucking about 60 metres. I've got a 12-foot Superior X rod. Just got some 8-pound line. Nice and simple, nice durable line. See if we get a bite while I'm chatting away. But I've opted for a method feeder opposed to a banjo feeder. So particularly later on in the year when the water's really cold, especially deeper waters or I'm casting a long way, generally, just keep an eye on my tip a minute, generally I like to use a hybrid feeder. The reason for that is, obviously you've got these walls around the feeder. It makes sure your bait's intact when it hits the water. On deeper venues, it's going to ensure you get into the bottom in one piece. And that's quite important in winter because you sat there waiting a long time. While I'm thinking about it, I'm going to start my stopwatch. Sat waiting a long time, so you want to have that confidence that your hook bait's still on top of that feeder or around the feeder, and it's not falling away as you've cast out or as it's dropping through the water. So generally on deeper venues, or if I'm waiting a long time, I will opt for a banjo feeder. But like I said, I've opted for a method feeder to begin with here today because we're chucking in really shallow water and there is the potential there to get a quick bite. So I'd rather be on a method feeder than a banjo feeder for that style of fishing. Obviously we're faced with a lot of open water today, so if I felt like I needed to change my feeder, be a bit more patient, maybe cast into the slightly deeper water that I've got closer to me, I will swap to a banjo feeder. And obviously with the ICS system, it only takes a few seconds to swap and change. So they're the two feeders I've got. Feeder size, I've got a medium method feeder on at the minute. I'm just keeping an eye on my tip, getting distracted. That's quite a nice size feeder for big carp. I think if you're waiting for a long time for bites, you might be leaving the feeder out there for 20 minutes or so. I think it's still nice to have that confidence in your head that you've got a bit of bait around the feeder. So for bigger fish, big carp, when you're waiting a long time, generally like to fish a sort of bigger feeder than you would say F1s in winter. You might drop down to a tiny ICM, something like that. But for big fish, we've gone for a decent sized feeder for this time of year. So as for bait choice, all I've got with me is 2mm fishery pellets. All I've done with them is just add a bit of water to them, not enough to cover them, just to sort of soak them, and then come back to them, stir them like a couple times. I've not oversaturated them. That's quite important, I think, not to go sort of over the top with the amount of water you put in the pellets. And then you can always add a bit more if they haven't got that stickiness there, but they're nice and sticky, they're going to break down nicely. And we're not chucking too far, so I don't have to worry about them being too sticky. Obviously we can add a little bit of bait booster to help with stickiness, stop them drying out. And also, importantly, this time of year, flavours can make a big difference. So touching on flavours, generally in winter, I opt for like a sweet to flavour, maybe like a Power Scopex, nice and sweet. That's a really good one in winter. This one's the haze, so this one might be something that I drizzle onto the method feeder before I cast out. And then the booster is something I add to the water or straight onto the pellets to sort of stop them breaking down so quick, give them a bit of stickiness, and obviously that boost of flavour. So moving on to the hook baits, I touched on them before. Because you're waiting a long time for bites generally, I want a really durable hook bait. I don't want the sort of doubt in my head that a skimmer has sort of chewed up my maggots or, you know, taken the hook bait. I want a nice durable hook bait that I know when a carp comes along, it's going to be there. And amongst them three offerings, them 2mm pellets, it's going to be there. So generally, I'd opt for a spikum wafter or one of the normal bandom wafters. The spikums are obviously like a boilie shape. So over the years, I've had a lot of confidence in like just a general round boilie shape. I think they're really easy for a fish to take in, sort of inconspicuous, and probably like, I don't know, 15-20 years ago, this is what was really popular. I think a lot of people have forgotten about these, but they used to be so good, particularly red ones and, you know, white ones. Like, they used to be really popular. I used to catch loads of fish on them. And then when bandoms come along, bandoms obviously were great because they were sort of a different shape. They were like a pellet shape, and they were something the fish hadn't seen before. But now these have become really popular. Going back to the sort of spikum rounder hook bait, I think is catching me a lot of fish. So it pays to have both of them with you. And I think there are times when I will go for one or the other. Like here today, we're faced with open water. I've actually been loose feeding like a line at 30 metres with 8mm pellets with a catapult. I think the bandoms go sort of hand in hand with that. If you're fishing a method feeder with a bandom and you're loose feeding pellets, then the fish are used to taking that sort of pellet shaped hook bait. So bandoms can be really effective fishing in amongst loose fed pellets. Obviously you've got the colours there. We'll touch on the colours in a minute, but they're sort of that sort of situation when I think the fish are feeding on pellets or it's a sort of a pellet venue. I will go for a sort of a bandom shape, but when you're out sort of in the middle of the lake like we are today, I think the round spikums can be really effective. That round hook bait just catches loads of fish, and the fish can just sort of take it in really easy, I think. So, I've actually got a bite, I think. There we go. Good timing. So, whilst we're playing this one, I'll talk to you about hook bait colours. Obviously, we're fishing a pink one today, and we're here at Packington Somers. We're on the Geary's Lake, and the water here is actually really coloured, just like a chocolate colour. It's like this all year round, even in winter. So I wouldn't be afraid of using a really hot, like highly visible hook bait, really bright. Obviously that pink one there is probably about as bright as it gets, really. This feels like a little carp or maybe a skimmer. Quite a long way to bring it back. Oh, it started fighting a bit. So, like I said, coloured water, I'll definitely start on a really bright hook bait. Pinks, oranges, maybe a yellow. But pink is generally my starting point, especially when it's really coloured. But when the water does cool down on other venues, it really pays to think about and experiment with hook bait colours. Obviously the spikums come in lots of different colours. Generally I've found when you're faced with clearer water, maybe like a washed out colour can be really effective, or maybe it's something a bit more natural, because I think the fish can sort of inspect the hook bait a bit more. So something like a yellow is obviously something they'd find quite naturally with sweet corn. But you know, a gin clear water and a bright pink hook bait is something that they might become a little bit wary of sometimes when it's gin clear. That fish is immaculate. See if we let me hold it up. Look at that fish. Looks like it's never been caught. That one's on the pink again, straight in the bottom lip, perfect. Size 12 MCM hook. So I don't want to change from a pink now, but maybe we'll try a red. There have been times in the past. I remember a time at Boddington, it's probably the first time I ever fished it, and it was really coloured. The only hook bait I could catch on was it was probably one of these prototypes actually, but it was a red hook bait just like this. This one's the Power Scopex Spikem. So all I need to do, got it there, I've got my bayonet in between my fingers, and it's just a case of pushing them in. Generally nice and soft. Push straight in with my fingernail, and then we're ready to go. One little tip, if you've got like an old tub of Bandams or the Spikums and they've gone a little bit hard, what you can do is get one of the Absolute liquids, the flavoured liquids, just drizzle a bit of that in your tub, leave them for a little while, and they will soften up again, and they'll be like a brand new hook bait. So while I'm loading the Method feeder, I'm actually going to talk to you about how I'm going to do that. So I mentioned potentially I'm going to be out there waiting for bites. So generally in summer you'd look to have your hook bait on the top of the feeder where it's sort of quickly released. This time I'm going to make sure I've got a few pellets in the mould first, and I want my hook bait sort of in the middle of that pile of feed. Reason for that, obviously I'm going to be waiting a long time for a bite, and I want to make sure that that hook bait is not going to get released too soon, and when it does, it's right in the middle of that sort of loose offering, so it's not on show there, it's all buried, it's inside, and hopefully by the time a fish comes along it'll be not nice and released. So I'm just going to cast this out. Got a bar in the middle of the lake, just cast next to one of the posts there. Start my stopwatch again. Just going to gently take up a bit of slack, be careful not to move the feeder. I've only got like a 30 gram size feeder on, so I want to make sure I don't want to move it. The wind's not too oh, what was that? Oh, it was a duck, I think. The wind's not too bad today, so I want to make sure I'm not moving that feeder. I've opted for 30 gram because I don't want to spook the fish that are there with a bigger feeder, which can sometimes happen when you've got a big feeder crashing into the water. And it's probably only about 18 inches deep out in the middle of the lake on that bar, so don't want to scare the fish that are there. You can actually see one swirl right over my feeder there, so that was key. I don't want to spook the fish that are there. So I've forgotten what I'm talking about. I think it was colours of hook baits. So I mentioned coloured water. I'd opt for a really bright hook bait, pinks and oranges. Also, if you're fishing in, maybe it's a deep venue but it's actually quite clear, sometimes a really bright hook bait like a pink and orange can be really effective, especially for bream. Obviously when you're fishing in deeper water, sometimes them fish have got to go a long way down to see the feeder, so having a bright hook bait there can be really effective, especially for bream. And bream, probably not a species you'd associate with looking for different colours, but it's amazing how they'll switch on to one particular colour. So it's always worth having a few pots of spikums and bandums with you, just swap and change and see what's best on the day and what's working on the particular venue that you're fishing. So while I wait for another bite, I'm going to loose feed a few pellets and hopefully we'll catch a few more in a minute. Right, so we've had a brilliant session so far at Packington. I caught a few fish right out in the middle on a shallow bar, on a method feeder with spikums. Swapped and changed different colour hook baits. Had a little go on the red, but it was obvious that there were more bites to be had on the pink, so it's also always worth experimenting with different colours. One other point I want to touch on, especially when it's still warm. We're not right into winter, so it's also important to give yourself somewhere else to fish, especially later on in the day. You quite often find that fish, big carp, quite often feed later on in the day when maybe it warms up slightly or they've got a bit more confidence. So it's always worth giving yourself an area of the peg where the fish are going to come and feed. So I mean, if it was a feeder only match, I might be baiting up a peg sort of 20 metres out with a bait up feeder or maybe down the edge. But today we're loose feeding a few 8mm hard pellets just on a line about 25 metres out throughout the day. And it just means that if the fish really do start to feed confidently, then I've got a line there where the fish will come in and feed, but it's not really affecting my other line out in the middle. So might be worth now just having a little go on that line, because it's obviously later on in the day now. We've had quite a good session out in the middle, so I'm just going to reel this in and have a little drop in short over them loose fed pellets, and hopefully we'll get one or two more fish before I go home. One other point, I touched on different feeder types, so I'm just going to demonstrate how easy it is to swap and change feeders. Obviously I've just left with a stem now. All I did, pull that tail rubber off, slide the feeder off, and I can swap between feeders, different size feeders. We'll try a banjo feeder this time. Obviously it is a shallow lake and I am quite happy fishing a method, but it's always worth demonstrating how I actually load a banjo feeder if I was fishing in deeper water, or maybe I felt I was waiting a really long time for bites. Then a banjo feeder is a really good option, because it means your hook bait's protected, it's intact, it's more likely to be presented nicely after a long period of time. So all I do initially, load that feeder up with like a bit more of a stiff layer that sits inside the feeder. You can squeeze that on really hard, then I lay my hook bait over the top like so, and then I'll add another layer on top of that. Doesn't need to be loads of bait, that's pretty much all it needs to be. Final little squeeze and we can cast it out. So literally only fishing about 20-25 metres out where I've been loose feeding. Plop it in like that, let it sink to the bottom, and then we're waiting for a bite. One other point is I tend to have a rear rest, a gripper rest, and it just holds your rod in nice and secure. If I'm not paying attention, then I'm going to slacken off that clutch so a fish can take line off of my reel. It's not going to pull my rod in, so everything's nice and secure, everything's tightened up. That rod rest isn't going to go anywhere. I also use quite a short rest as well when I'm method feeder fishing. I think because the bites can be so savage, having a shorter rest just means your rod bends a bit more and you've got a bit more time. If that fish were to run off, you've got a bit more time to pick up the rod before you get any breakages or the hook pulls. So there's a few liners there actually straight away, so it's encouraging. Just going to loose feed over the top like I have been. So 4 or 5 8mm pellets at a time, just make a bit of noise. Any fish that are cruising by, it's going to grab their attention, hopefully they'll follow it down and find my method feeder, or banjo feeder in this case, in amongst it, and hopefully we'll get a bite soon. The other point worth mentioning, so I've not set my stopwatch, is about this baby, the stopwatch. Especially in winter when you're waiting a long time for bites, it's hard to gauge how much time has passed, so having a stopwatch just means that I can be a little bit more patient, and I'm not there reeling in all the time, putting too much bait in my peg potentially. But it's also worth paying attention to the time that you get your bite. So it's been quite obvious when we've been fishing out in the middle today that the bites have generally come between sort of 4 and 7 minutes, mainly about 6 minutes has been good. So it makes sense to sort of at least give myself the chance of catching like 7-8 minutes before I recast. I'd be happy to leave it out there sort of 10 minutes if that was happening at a time, and then recast, maybe try a different spot. It's been obvious that we've had to sort of cast tight to then post in the middle. That's been a bit of a focal point for the fish today, so it's worth keeping an eye on your stopwatch and paying attention to what the bite time is, and hopefully you'll pick up some sort of pattern. So there's a few tips and tricks. Hopefully you've picked up a few little tips today about hook baits and experimenting, and how to go about fishing the method feeder this time of year, and hopefully it will help you catch a few more fish. See you next time.